AP Biology, Plant Diversity, Chapters 29 and 30, Part 1. Your learning goal is to be able to convey to another student what alternation of generations is, as well as characteristics of major plant phyla called divisions. Our success criteria: given a set of characteristics, determine the plant division. The first plants. For more than 3 billion years, Earth's terrestrial surface, or land surface, was lifeless. Life evolved in the oceans. This is where we find the oldest of our fossils. And the first photosynthetic organisms were aquatic green algae. These are the oldest photosynthesizers that we find on this planet. Remember what endosymbiosis is? Where we think the mitochondria and chloroplasts were engulfed by an ancient eukaryote to become the modern cells of plants today. This time, let's get our first notes on Chapter 29 and 30, Biodiversity. Go ahead and pause at this time and copy this down. As you can see, we have some red and green algae at the bottom there, and they're basically simple types of plants. However, they're not considered true plants because they don't have true tissues or groups of cells that have the same function. Here we have some chlorophytes. These are types of algae. Again, these are not truly considered plants because they don't have true tissues, groups of cells that have the same function. Here we have some more ancient or simple plants. Right, land plants. Here we have a cladogram. Remember, a cladogram is a family tree of evolutionary relationships. Every point where you have a branching is a common ancestor. The oldest plants are the bryophytes. Now, these are the actual true plants that have true tissues. We have even more ancient plants called Chirophyceans, but they don't have true tissues, including green algae, but they're not true plants either. Land plants evolved about 500 million years ago, and the first ones we find are bryophytes. Now, bryophytes include things like liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. They are very close to the ground, and there's a good reason for that. They lack tubes for transport, and as a result of lacking tubes for transport, they are fairly short. The next major evolutionary leap in plants and the next division of plants are the pteridophytes. The pteridophytes include things like ferns, and ferns do have vascular tissue, so they can grow a lot higher, and they have an advantage over the bryophytes because they can do that. They have tubes called xylem and phloem that transport sugars and water. The xylem transports water mainly, and the phloem transports sugars. The next major evolutionary leap was the gymnosperms. Now, before that, we have sperm and egg as far as transferring gametes. However, gymnosperms have pollen, and pollen are basically the cells, or have the cell, that will become two sperm when it lands on another cone. Another evolutionary advantage is seeds. Seeds have protection from drying out on land, and gymnosperms have it, pteridophytes and bryophytes don't. The most advanced plants on this planet are the angiosperms. The angiosperms have the vascular tissue for growing tall, think a maple tree. They also have pollen, which is protection from drying out on land, and they have seeds. However, they also have flowers, and flowers are a reproductive structure to attract pollinators. At this time, we're going to copy down this cladogram. Label this cladogram of plant divisions. Plant divisions and phylums are the same thing. In the plant world, we call them divisions and not phylums. The most ancient plants are the bryophytes that are truly considered plants. we have detritivores, ferns. Then we have the gymnosperms. And then finally, the last thing we find evolving as far as plants are the angiosperms, or flowering plants. Alrighty. Pause at this time, copy this down. Alright, here we have some adaptations for land growth, and the first one is called an apical meristem. Now you may not know this, but plants grow from their tips, and these tips are rapidly dividing cells that are undergoing mitosis. They're embryonic cells. The rest of the plant is not actively dividing its cells. It's only dividing really from the tips. The tips are called apical meristems. The apical means it's on the very top of the plant or the very bottom in the roots, and meristem refers to the rapidly dividing cells. Now, the reason why this is kind of important is because if you're living in the water, there's really no place to grow. You can't grow up very easily unless you're in a shallow lake or pond. On land, there's a definite survival advantage to be able to grow taller. If you can grow taller than the other plants around you, you have a survival and reproductive advantage. That's called an adaptation. And as a result of growing taller, you can grab that light first, that's a resource, and you are able to basically effectively get that energy before other lower plants can get it. So that's the survival advantage of an apical meristem. You're able to grow taller. We also have adaptations for reproduction, living on land. Alternation of generations, as we're going to talk about later, we have a reduced gametophyte generation that's very sensitive to drying out on land. We also have walled spores that prevent desiccation or drying out. We also have multicellular reproductive structures that can make things like the pollen from gametangia. Those are going to be the male gametes. And we have multicellular dependent embryos within a seed that is going to protect the seed from drying out, or protect the embryo within the seed from drying out. And then we also have adaptations against water loss. A cuticle is a waxy covering that prevents the water from evaporating right through the leaves. And these are adaptations all plants have. At this time, let's go ahead and just copy down the slide. Let's label in your notes adaptations of land plants and list these adaptations. Let's go ahead and add to our notes found in all land plants. Pause at this time and copy this down. Okay, moving on. Here we have the apical meristem at the very tip. Here we have rapidly dividing cells growing upwards. Remember, we did a lab on this where we had to count the stages of mitosis. Here we have the apical meristem at the tip. The root cap itself is dead cells, but here's where we have a lot of cell division. And this helps us grow down into the dirt if you're living on land, as well as up if you're the top of the plant, the stems. Alternation of generations. Now, if you remember, with animals, we are mainly diploid. We have two sets of chromosomes, and the only time we have haploid stages of our life cycle is when we're making gametes, or sex cells. Plants are a little bit different. They have a distinctive haploid part of their life cycle. You know, for us, it's just sperm and eggs, but for plants, some plants especially, have a very large part of their life cycle dominated by cells that only have one set of chromosomes. So we're going to talk about that coming up, and we have a sketch coming up. At this time, I would like you to copy down these two terms, sporophyte and gametophyte. Let's go ahead and write down all this information in our notes. The sporophyte is a multicellular diploid part of the life cycle of a plant, where all the cells have two sets of chromosomes, just like us. This is formed from fertilization, remember, a sperm and an egg forming a zygote, and then mitosis produces cells that are genetically identical, having two sets of chromosomes. The sporophyte is going to produce haploid spores through meiosis, and this is going to get kind of weird, and we're going to draw a sketch of this in a second. Remember, we don't first of all, we don't make spores, and these spores can turn into a whole plant by themselves, depending on the plant. The gametophyte is also multicellular, but it's all haploid, or one set of chromosomes, and these are produced from the spores that are also haploid. Now here's where it gets kind of weird. These spores will sprout and form the gametophyte that's also haploid. So we're going from haploid spore to haploid gametophyte, which is completely different from us animals. The gametophyte is going to make the gametes, which are going to fuse to form the zygote. And that's important to remember. Repeat after me. The sporophyte makes spores. The gametophyte makes gametes. Don't get that confused. The gametophyte doesn't come from gametes, it makes the gametes. So you might want to underline that. Produces egg and sperm, makes the gametes. Sporophyte makes the spores. Alright, at this time we're going to copy down this sketch into our notes. This is alternation of generations. Let's go ahead and start with the zygote. And this is a background knowledge type of a thing. Everyone's familiar with a zygote. That's two sets of chromosomes formed from a sperm and egg. Fertilization, just like us. However, and just like us, the zygote can undergo mitosis. Remember, in humans and other animals, we make our body cells, our somatic cells, by mitosis. In the plant world, they do mitosis of the zygote and produce a sporophyte that's going to be multicellular. Now, typically when you see a tree, like a maple tree or a palm tree, it's all sporophyte. So most of the time when you look into a forest or look into any area with lots of plants, you're going to see the sporophyte. However, there are some plants that have a different part of their life cycle, the gametophyte, that's dominant, and we'll talk about that later. The sporophyte, if you remember, makes the spores. Now, remember that the spores are not made by mitosis. You're going from diploid, two sets of chromosomes, to haploid, one set of chromosomes. The spores are haploid. So if we're going from two sets to one set, what process does that? That's meiosis. Isn't that weird? In humans and other animals, we do meiosis to make our sex cells, our gametes. In plants, they do meiosis from the sporophyte to make haploid spores. And each one of these spores, without a sperm or egg, can become its own part of the plant's life cycle. These spores will develop into something called a gametophyte. Now remember, we're going from haploid to haploid, and to do that, we do mitosis. Mitosis, same number of chromosomes, genetically identical cells. The gametophyte, if you remember, produces gametes. And when we make those gametes, they're going to be made by mitosis. We're going from haploid to haploid. Once we have the male gametes made by one part of the plant and the female gametes made by another part of the plant or a different plant, they can fuse together, just like we do, and form a zygote. So go and sketch this out and go through it several times until you got this down. This is kind of complicated. We start with a zygote. See if you can do this from memory. Zygote does mitosis, produces all the cells in the plant, called the sporophyte. The diploid sporophyte produces haploid spores by meiosis. The haploid spores develop into the haploid gametophyte by mitosis, going from haploid to haploid. The gametophyte makes gametes, also by mitosis, going from haploid to haploid. The male and female gametes fuse together and form a zygote, which is diploid, which will undergo mitosis to produce the sporophyte. Once again, remember, meiosis only happens to make spores. All right, pause at this time and copy down this diagram. All right, walled spores. So what's the advantage here? Well, we have spores produced by something called sporangia, and you're not going to have that memorized. However, I do want you to know that spores are adapted to life on dry land. Let's go and write that down. Walled spores, adaptation for living on land, and the advantage is that they're tough and resistant to harsh environments. Here's a fern spore, and that's a survival advantage. Especially living on land, you have to worry about things like drying out, and that's a big deal for both plants and animals. Here we have a multicellular gametangia that produces gametes. Now in these plants, the gametophyte, which is what the gametangia is actually inside the sporophyte. So there's a sporophyte protecting the gametophyte, and we'll talk more about that later. Multicellular dependent embryos. So one of the big advantages to modern land plants is the production of seeds. And these seeds have a food supply right over here. There is a tough coat around the seed, and then we have the little embryo using the food supply to make itself bigger and bigger. This is an adaptation for land plants for survival in dry environments. You got this thick coat and a food supply. Think about how like eggs from chickens have kind of the same thing going on. They have a different protective surface. They have a different food supply, which would be a yolk, instead of like the starch inside of a seed. But it's the same basic idea. or transferring food from the seed to the embryo. And that is a survival advantage on land called multicellular dependent embryos. They're dependent on the seed. That's multicellular. Alright, adaptations against water loss. You already wrote this down. A cuticle is that shiny waxy covering on the outside of plants, and this is protection against desiccation. Repeat after me. Desiccation means drying out. This waxy lipid coating is hydrophobic. If you remember, lipids are hydrophobic in general and protect against, they act as a water barrier. Alright, so here we have the four major groups, the bryophytes. You have to know these examples and some of the characteristics that we're going to talk about now. Bryophytes are the simplest plants. They include mosses and liverworts. If you can imagine like a frog sitting on a lily pad, that lily pad would be a type of bryophyte. Moss, everyone's seen that. It's like that green furry stuff that grows in the forest. That's also a bryophyte. It's non-vascular, it doesn't have tubes, and that's why it's very close to the ground. Pteridophytes are the next most advanced plants. They include ferns. You'll see some pictures in a minute. They do have vascular tissues, so they can grow pretty tall. They're the more common types of plants you see during dinosaur times with gymnosperms. And they're seedless, so these pteridophytes and bryophytes reproduce by sperm and eggs. Imagine that, little sperm swimming through the water and fertilizing an egg to produce bryophytes and pteridophytes. If they get too far away from water, they dry out, and if they dry out, they're not going to survive. Gymnosperms have vascular tissues like pteridophytes, but they have seeds, and these seeds offer protection from drying out. However, these are naked seeds, they don't have a fruit around it. Conifers, things like pine trees, are typical examples of gymnosperms. Think of needle trees as gymnosperms. Then we have angiosperms, the flowering plants. They include maple trees, and most of the trees that you see without needles are angiosperms. Also, most of the plants you see on the ground are angiosperms too. Now, they all produce flowers, but sometimes the flowers aren't very obvious. For example, the grass on the ground does produce flowers, but they're not big, tulip-type flowers. They're smaller flowers that are not adapted to the same pollination techniques. Also, angiosperms have seeds enclosed in a fruit. They're not naked seeds. The fruit is an adaptation for dispersal of seeds that we'll talk about later too. All right, and here we have the cladogram again. You can review this. Okay, moving on. All right, at this time, let's go ahead and copy down this table. This has all the major land adaptations specific to each one of the plant divisions. The bryophytes, they do have cuticles, apical meristems, but they don't have much else as far as adaptations. They have no vascular tissue, no tubes for transport, so that's why bryophytes will always be close to the ground. They have no pollen to protect the male gametes, so they have to be near water, otherwise the male gametes, the sperm, dries out. They have no seeds, so they have to fertilize their eggs in water, or within the plant rather. And then we have flowers. Flowers are adaptations for spreading seeds. Pteridophytes do have vascular tissue, but no pollen, seeds, or flowers. Gymnosperms have vascular tissue and pollen and seeds, but they're naked seeds. They're not covered by fruit, and they have no flowers. Angiosperms have all of these things. Also, let's go ahead and add to this flowers and fruit. You should know that. All right, let's pause at this time and copy down this table. Okay, moving on. All right, so we're going to go through each one of these plant divisions, starting with the simplest, the bryophytes. Remember, they're non-vascular, no water transport system, no tubes, called xylem and phloem. They have flagellated sperm, so they need to be in water. This is important. Life cycle dominated by the gametophyte stage. So this is something that you should know about bryophytes. This is the only division of plants that has the gametophyte, which is haploid, one set of chromosomes, dominant in its life cycle. The sporophyte is actually a smaller part of its life cycle, which is not true of those other three plant divisions. They also use spores for reproduction. They don't have any specialized structures for reproduction like seeds. Let's go ahead and add to this table here. Under bryophytes, let's go ahead and write underneath it, gametophyte dominant. Gametophyte dominant. And then for pteridophyte, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, sporophyte dominant, with the sporophyte becoming more dominant as we go through time. Alright, so here we have the diploid sporophyte, and as you can see, it's not a very big part of the plant. It's just the top part there. The haploid part is most of the green stuff of the plant, and that's kind of uncommon for plants. Most of the time, remember, these haploid cells only have one set of chromosomes, and that's not typical for the other three divisions. Mosses must live in water, otherwise they dry out. Here's some more bryophytes, mosses and liverworts, some more examples. Alright, now it gets pretty complicated with alternation of generations, so we're just going to go through this very quickly, and you don't have to know any details other than the diagram that you wrote down earlier. However, let's just kind of point out some of the stages here. We have the zygote. The blue represents haploid, and you can see there's a lot of blue here, so there's a lot of haploid part of its life cycle. That's going to be different from the other plants. The zygote here, if you remember, is diploid, 2N, and if you refer back to your alternation of generations diagram, the zygote will undergo mitosis to produce the sporophyte. And then that sporophyte makes what? Sporophyte makes spores. So we have the sporophyte making spores. Here we have spores produced by the sporophyte here. And the sporophyte will develop into the gametophyte. Now there's two types of spores. We have one spore that develops into the male gametophyte, and another type of spore that develops into the female gametophyte. Now remember, these sporophytes were diploid, and these spores are haploid, so to produce those spores we did meiosis, and again, refer to your alternation of generations diagram. These spores turn into the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte makes the gametes. These gametes will fuse together, sperm and egg, haploid, one set of chromosomes, and form the zygote, and then that's the life cycle. Alright, let's move on. Bryophyte, moss life cycles. Here we have the sporophyte at the top and the gametophyte at the bottom. It's just mostly gametophyte. Here we have the sporophyte on the top, producing the spores. Peat bog is just a huge area of bryophytes. They have to live near water. Imagine those sperm swimming through the water. Right, tridophytes. These are vascular plants. They have transport system of tubes that can move stuff up and down. They do have flagellated sperm, and their life cycle is dominated by the sporophyte. They have a very fragile gametophyte protected by the sporophyte, and these guys produce spores too. These things at the bottom here are called sori. Sori are spore-producing structures. So if you ever look at a fern, look at the bottom of the leaf, and you can tell what a fern looks like. It has these little fronds. They look like little leaflets, and these parts here produce haploid spores. Tridophytes. We have some more ferns, basically. Remember, these do not have seeds, no flowers, but they do have vascular tissue, so they can grow pretty high. And that can block out light from lower plants, and that gives them a survival advantage on land. Here we have the diploid sporophyte, which is most of the fern's life cycle. Here we have sori, which are spore structures. Remember, the sporophyte makes spores, and these are where the spores are being made. Here's something kind of interesting. These spores will turn into the gametophyte, and here we have the haploid gametophyte that looks kind of like a little heart-shaped thing, and we'll see another picture later. This haploid gametophyte makes the gametes, and it's very close to the ground, and it looks very much different from the diploid sporophyte. So this is the major part of the fern's life cycle, but there is a part of the life cycle of the plant which is all haploid, and it looks like a little flat lily pad kind of a structure that makes gametes. Imagine if we had that in our life cycle, where we had a totally different stage, where we looked completely different, that made our gametes, and then we came back together to make a person. And this is what plants do, especially with these tridophytes, these ferns. Alright, let's write this down. Homospory. Bisexual gametophyte. That means that it has both the male and female spores in one structure. This is the gametophyte of the tridophytes, the ferns. This makes the gametes that will fuse together to form a zygote that will eventually form the fern. Here we have a lot of tridophytes during the ancient forests of early dinosaur times, and even before that a lot of our fossil fuels come from today. Here we have some modern Tridophytes, ferns. And here's the tridophyte life cycle. Again, let's go ahead and start with the zygote. The zygote is going to undergo mitosis to produce the sporophyte. The sporophyte is going to make the spores by meiosis. The spores are haploid, coming from a diploid sporophyte. The spores become, by mitosis, the gametophyte. It's haploid to haploid. Blue represents haploid. And then we have the haploid gametophyte producing the gametes, both the egg and sperm. The egg and sperm come together, form the gametes. The egg and sperm are the gametes, come together and form a zygote, a fertilized egg, and then the fertilized egg undergoes mitosis to produce the sporophyte. All right, this ends part 1 of chapter 29 and 30, plant diversity.